There's always a little lag time, and now we are live. So this is our first video chat for the MASCOM 101 class that I teach here, John. And we've got a couple of people watching, and this will be archived on YouTube, so the rest of the class will watch it, you know, sometime in the next week or so. So I'm really glad that you could join us. Thank you so much. I'm sorry for maybe being confusing with the technical aspects of this, but hey, we're connected now, so that's cool.
My pleasure.
Over the past couple of days, students have submitted some questions by email, on Facebook, on SurveyMonkey, and I shared those with you. I know we don't have time in the next 30 minutes to do, you know, all of these questions, but I thought let's pick some of them and kind of unpack them, okay?
Sure.
So, and maybe the first thing is just a short bio. Students have read your bio on Amazon in connection with detecting bull, so they know a little bit about you, but elaborate on your career both as a journalist and as a scholar.
Okay, I grew up, or sort of came of age, in the 1960s, back in the last millennium, and at that time there was a lot of optimism among young people that we could change the world, and so I was very eager to do that, and I thought that journalism might be a good way, a good vehicle for that ambition. And so I became a journalist, and I worked at very small papers, and then somewhat larger papers, and finally at a moderately large paper at the Norfolk newspapers, the Ledger Star first, and then later the Virginian Pilot. I left journalism to write a story about it. One of the things that I encountered in journalism pretty consistently was what I would call commercial bias, which is to say pandering to market pressures rather than reporting the news for the public good. And so I managed to secure a fellowship to Stanford to go and study and earn a PhD. And I then, for my dissertation, I had the pleasure, really, of being able to explore some of the ideas and looking at how market pressures affected small, medium, and large television stations. And I think a lot of what I learned generalizes to all media, whether it's online or in a paper or on TV or radio or other media that I'm not aware of. So that's how I came to this. Then I taught for a few years as a journalism professor after leaving Stanford, and then left that to do research for the Berkeley Media Studies Group. And then created my own project at Stanford called Grade the News, which was an effort to do for news in the San Francisco Bay Area what Consumer Reports does for products like you know, televisions and cars and computers. So we randomly sampled the most popular Bay Area media, both broadcast and newspapers, and we sampled them on the same news cycle, the morning paper and the previous evening's news broadcasts. And we evaluated them on 7 yardsticks of journalistic quality. And I found we basically rated them from A to F. And I promised the Knight Foundation and the Ford Foundation, which supported this work, that I would write a book that would detail what I'd learned and help consumers do their own news evaluation. So that's how I got to writing the books Detecting Bull and Don't Be Fooled.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Let's see. In the lecture that we did this week, I introduced students to the smell test because we were talking about media literacy, news literacy. And one of the students online suggested, could you walk us through the smell test and how we might apply it to a particular news story?
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. I chose, when I was writing this, I was trying to find an acronym that would basically be comprehensive enough to cover the important questions one should ask when interrogating the news for its validity. And yet still had some sort of intuitive appeal to it. And I came up with the smell test because I think throughout time, humans have used their sense of smell to avoid consuming things that might harm them. And I think to some extent, we are what we read and watch in terms of our understanding of the environment around us. And so the S stands for source. Who's telling me this? And we'll come back to that in a moment to flesh it out a little bit. The M stands for motivation. We know that when someone's trying to persuade us of something, that they tend to cherry pick facts and not give us the full story. So when we sense that there is a persuasive agenda, we should be particularly on guard for bias. The E is for evidence. What evidence does the source provide to persuade, to flesh out the story, to give us a sense of why they've made the conclusions that they've made, even if it's just a conclusion in the lead of the story, the sort of the nub or premise of the story. The first L is for logic. Does the evidence compel the conclusions they reach, the generalizations that they provide? And the last L is for left out. What's not here? What are they not telling us? I think probably the biggest story globally is about global warming, because it affects all of us in very profound ways, as we're seeing every day. There have been terrible fires in California, as you may have read about. There have been fires even above the Arctic Circle in Sweden. The climate is changing, and in ways that are creating multiple disasters. And so if that's the major issue, it's certainly a controversial one. We have a president in the White House who denies that it's happening. We have people leading the Environmental Protection Agency, which is supposed to protect us, that are trying to suppress the evidence for global climate change and trying to destroy the regulations that might help us head it off or protect us from it. So I can't think of a bigger issue or a more controversial one. So a friend of mine who is a libertarian, is an engineer from South Carolina, sent me a link to a story from the Daily Mail, a tabloid, actually the second best read tabloid in Britain. And it was basically making the claim that the warming in the, on land at least, was due to an El Nino event, which is a warming of the waters in the Western Pacific, which tends to heat up the planet. And that's all it was. It was basically a natural cycle, and there was no need for governments to do anything drastic to change the production of CO2 and other so-called greenhouse gases, because it really was just natural variation that we were seeing. And so I looked at that article and I thought, well, this would be a great one to walk through the smell test and see if it works. So the first thing I did is I looked at the source, of course, and the immediate source was my friend, who is, he's not really a friend, he's an acquaintance, who's really a rabid conservative, a Trump supporter, but a very bright guy, very clearly, and well-educated. So the secondary source was the Daily Mail. So first thing I did is I Googled the Daily Mail, and I found out that it's a very popular tabloid, but that it tends to have a very conservative take on the world. So I raised my skepticism levels a bit just to analyze it. So I read the article and I tried to see what its motivation was. If its motivation was journalistic, it would simply be giving all the facts as best the journalist could discover them. But when I looked more closely at it, it struck me that it was really trying to persuade us. But I wanted to give it the benefit of the doubt for the purpose of my test. And so I said, okay, let's assume that this is really a serious journalistic effort, because it's going to be read by many people, and it clearly was influential. It was online. It was picked up by my friends in South Carolina and spread through conservative networks. So I looked for the next element of the test, the evidence that they provided. They quoted 3 sources about climate change. One of them was a very, very eminent source, the head of the EPA, the head of the climate change part of the government. The part of the government studied it, a guy named Gavin Schmidt. And he was an excellent choice of source because he was hands-on, he had knowledge of it, he had expertise, and working from the government's point of view, he was independent. He wasn't tied to either an environmentalist group or to a fossil fuel company. There was also a professor from Georgia Tech who since retired, who was skeptical of climate change. Gavin Schmidt, he's actually at NASA, is a strong proponent of the science behind climate change, that it's real, that it's man-made. And the third was someone who worked for a foundation, David Whitehouse, worked for a foundation in England, which has as its avowed purpose debunking climate science, basically claiming that there's no such thing as global warming, or if there is, it's natural variation and not human originated. That was only three sources for such an article that was basically claiming that that the evidence shows that climate change is simply due to natural variation, in this case an El Nino year. Struck me as very light sourcing for a story that with such a broad claim. So the evidence struck me as pretty insubstantial. And basically what we had is a very strong source saying, basically arguing against the thesis of the story, saying, no, it's real. We had a professor who studies this saying that she's a skeptic. And then we had someone from a skeptic foundation saying, no, it's not real. It's just natural variation. So from evidence, we want to go to logic, the first L. And it was interesting looking at the site. They produced a graph, and I'm going to refer to my book here so that I get it right. The graph showed temperature fluctuations on land from 1995 to 2020, projected to 2020. And the baseline was the long-term average, which they established as 1978 to 1998. What's interesting about this graph, and it's included in my book, is that if you really draw the midpoint between the fluctuations each year and the temperature, you'll find that it's about half a degree warmer than the long-term average between 78 and 98, which is a direct contradiction of the thesis of the story. Now, clearly the graph shows that El Nino temperatures were higher than non-El Nino years, but the average for all El Nino years and non was substantially elevated, particularly over the short period of time of the graph, above the average from the 20 years previous, 1998 going back 20 years. So the evidence that they provided contradicted the thesis of the story, because it showed that temperatures have risen, even in this short period of time, over land in a regardless of whether it was an El Nino year or not. So the evidence, the logic of the evidence essentially contradicts the thesis of the story. Now, there's another problem with this that some of you may already have discovered, which is that the Earth is only about 30% covered by land. So saying that temperatures on land have fluctuated only due to natural variation ignores the ocean, ignores 70% of the issue. And if you've taken any physics, you know that water absorbs heat more deeply and over a longer time. It holds it more than land does. So what we're seeing here is essentially a one-year reading of a temperature fluctuation in 2017, a drop of about 1 degree Celsius due to El Nino, being extrapolated into a trend. And if you've had statistics, you know that it takes at least 3 data points, and usually a lot more, to establish a trend. And also, even if you look at their own data, the temperature of 2017 was higher than the average of the 20 years before. And their conclusion is based on 30% of the world's global covering, which is the land. So it's really a pretty ridiculous argument. Then you go to the last L, which is left out. And what what you can do, what I really encourage you to do whenever you're trying to analyze a story, and you wouldn't do this on every story, only the things you think are more important, is to Google the thesis of the story, which is, in this case, global warming is due to natural variation, not man-made factors, or just global temperatures, not just land temperatures, and look for graphs, and look for them from authoritative sources such as the NASA or EPA or other independent sources. And what you find is that the story left out the fact that global temperatures and sea temperatures have risen sharply, and that the last 3 years, the 2014, 15, and 16, were the hottest years on record since any government has been keeping records. So those are pretty significant omissions for a story with as broad a claim as this. Yeah. So I think the smell test did a good job of unmasking what's essentially propaganda. Mm-hmm. But it was clever enough propaganda that even my friend, who is a very sophisticated engineer, took it as truth. And I think the most dangerous stories are not the ones about, say, some really fake things, such as the Clintons operating a pedophile ring out of a pizza store parlor in Washington, D.C. But I think the most important ones are the ones that have a real factual veneer, that seem like they're real, they do provide evidence, they do seem to be authoritative at first glance. But when you examine them, and fortunately it's really easy to examine them now given the resources of the internet, you find that it's simply clever propaganda. Mm-hmm. And one with enormous consequences for all of us.
Well, and I think a great example of how the smell test, whoops, I'm getting some feedback here. John, you might mute your microphone when I speak so we don't get that reverb, although it seems like it's working now. I think the smell test is a great idea for breaking down a news story like that and really kind of looking at whether it holds together. And having read your book, of course, I know you've got another mnemonic device for assessing the trustworthiness of the source itself, the pie test, or
pie chart.
Pie chart. So can you walk us through that as well?
Sure. One thing that I sort of alluded to in this analysis with the smell test of the Daily Mail story is the quality of the sources. Not all sources are equal. And so what I suggest you do is you pie chart, which is another acronym, of the sources within the story. And the P stands for proximity. Is this firsthand information? Was this person an eyewitness, or is it hearsay? Are they someone who is sort of has a hands-on perspective on whatever they're reporting? The I is for independence. Are they independent of conflicts of interest? Do they have a neutral view, or do they have skin in the game that's likely to bias the answers they give to the reporters' questions? And the E is for either deep experience, or expertise. Do they know what they're talking about? And I think if you do this, you'll find oftentimes that sourcing is pretty haphazard and random. And oftentimes you're seeking a source, if you're an ideologically oriented newsroom, that supports your viewpoint rather than a source that really has something important to say to the public. In this case, it was really interesting. Journalists often will sort of triangulate toward the truth. They'll look for somebody on one side, somebody on another side, assuming the story is so simple that it only has two sides, and then some independent expert in the middle. In this story, the independent expert was the Gavin Schmidt of NASA, who's really off the charts in terms of his pi score. The source on the first denial source, the professor actually gave up her position. I Googled her at Georgia Tech because she was kind of hounded out for ignoring science. And the second source came from a foundation whose purpose is to try to diminish belief in climate change. And so very compromised. And so if you look at those sources, instead of using Gavin Schmidt, the NASA source, as your independent expert, you say, he says, she says, but the independent expert says, well, the strongest evidence is on this side, which helps the public make decisions. Instead, they were using Gavin Schmidt as simply a source, a partisan source on one side of the story. And if you're an experienced journalist, you would see that pretty quickly, that they were basically mishandling triangulation. And the fact is, you'd want many more. If you're going to make a claim as broad as global warming is a hoax, then you would need a lot of sources to try to substantiate that.
Interesting. One of the members of our class, after looking at the smell test information that we found online, an article that you had written, poses this question: should we discount information just because a source is sketchy? If I'm looking at a Drudge report, for example, and I know that Drudge is often sensationalistic and would prefer to be first than right, but how should I parse the trustworthiness of information just based on the source itself? I guess, does the source alone negate whether I should believe something?
This reminds me of what editors often said to me, and you might have had this experience too, Jeff, when you were in the newsroom. The typical first response of an editor to a reporter coming in with some sort of wild-eyed story is interesting if true. Mm-hmm. And also, I think of my youngest son, Adam, when he was about 4 years old. His lips were smeared with chocolate, and I accused him of getting into the cookie jar. And he looked at me wide-eyed and said, "How can you know?" And it struck me that he was a compromised source. So I didn't believe anything he said. The trouble is that all sources are biased. All humans are biased. We can't escape it. But what we can do, using techniques like the pie chart, is to try to distinguish between better and worse sources. And just because someone said it, just because it's printed, just because it appears on television or on the internet, doesn't mean it's true. We are seeing a tsunami of news which is deliberately falsified. And we're seeing people make money. You think of Alex Jones and his InfoWar. He earns a very handsome salary, as does Rush Limbaugh and do the owners of Fox News, by peddling nonsense from a perspective on the right that they know is going to sell well. And so they're basically, essentially, ranting for ratings. They're basically making money off of the lack of skepticism and the prejudices and the resentments of a substantial part of the public. And that leads to consequences such as we see currently in the White House.
That kind of anticipates actually a question that a student posed. And I think this is interesting because it comes at more from the standpoint of being a journalist. So this student asks, is there ever a point at which it's impossible for journalists to be unbiased about a news story or use facts that don't come from biased sources? And, I guess how do journalists avoid injecting opinions into stories? Or can they avoid that? And if they can't, is there something else that journalists can do to make their stories fair? I get, fair and balanced, to use Fox's phrase.
The short answer is that journalists are never impartial, completely, never unbiased, nor are any sources that they quote. Humans are inherently biased. There was a good analysis of this, I think, by one of the early black journalists at the Washington Post, a guy named Robert, I think, Maynard. And he created something called a fault lines analysis. He said that he's writing from California. He was the publisher of the Oakland Tribune at the time. And he was saying California is divided by all these fault lines, but so is society. And those fault lines he listed were things like gender, generation, groupings that we're in, such as political affiliations. And he gave good examples of this, and I use all of them in the book, and I'm sorry that I can't immediately reproduce all of them. But we do see that men and women often see the same thing as very different from each other, that people of different generations, millennials, see things oftentimes quite differently than their elders, that geography was another one, that people who live in wealthy neighborhoods don't look at the problem of, say, police violence the same way that people who live in poor neighborhoods, who are more likely to experience that kind of violence, look at things. So there are all these things that are baked into our viewpoint. And the best that journalists can hope for, I think, is to try to be aware of his or her own biases. And something that's helpful in this is something called Project Implicit, or the Implicit Bias Test, which you can look up online and take yourself, which indicates that you may have prejudices maybe against fat people or dark people or light people or whatever it may be that you're not even aware of. And it tries to help surface those. And surfacing our biases is the first step toward trying to get some sort of hold on them. We're not able to see all of them, I think. And I think journalists need to be much more humble and basically give up this nonsense that they can be objective or their sources can be objective, and instead be empirical, which means that they look for the best data, the best evidence. They try to find the best sources, the ones who they feel are telling the truth most clearly. And that's our best hope. Journalism is often called, or sometimes called, the first draft of history. And it's very much a rough draft. And the fact that even excellent news media, such as the New York Times or NPR or the Washington Post, get it wrong is partly is something they can't avoid if they're trying to respond to things very quickly, and they can't stand back for a week, a year, 20 years, a generation, the way that historians or others can, to find out what's really going on. They have to put together a picture of the world as best they can. And that's why newsrooms need to be diverse, because a black reporter, for example, who comes out of a poor neighborhood is going to write about, say, housing in a community much more, probably differently than a white reporter who looks at gentrification as a positive thing and say rich people moving in and displacing the people who live there, whereas the African-American reporter might see it as displacement of people who've been longtime residents who are being evicted simply because they don't have the means to stay. So, and we've learned a lot, with the Me Too movement about women's perspectives and about how widespread kind of a sense of male privilege and the abuse of power in jobs and other things to take advantage of women's vulnerability. So the best you can hope for as a journalist is to be an empiricist, sort of like someone with a white lab coat, a scientist in a hurry.
Mm-hmm. I'm really glad you brought up the fault lines paradigm, because I use that a lot in my teaching while I'm teaching journalism classes, about how you need to see where your own blind spots are and then reach across those fault lines, get the voices that don't look like you into the story, get those perspectives, and make that story more comprehensive, more accurate. And I think the Bob Maynard's legacy the Maynard Institute, has been really good at helping journalists come to grips with that.
Yes, yeah, it's an excellent resource. It was one of the first things I saw when I was doing research for my books was, this is a nifty analysis of why we don't understand each other. Mm-hmm. And the very difficult task of a journalist to sort of be a bridge, to stretch across different constituencies and try to present a picture of the world which is empirically accurate as best they can. Yeah. And also to come back when they're wrong and to admit it. There's a new book out of Harvard that looks at how people use media that's ideologically oriented. And they found that news sources on the left will often publish stories that are incendiary that later turn out to be false. But once they're discovered to be false, the mainstream media tends not to pick these up. They tend to say, "Oh, we checked it out. It's not true. We're not going to give it more oxygen." Where on the right, they found that it didn't matter whether the story was true or not. It still sold to their audience. It still stoked the passions of their audience. It had commercial value. And who cares if it's true or not? Mm. There's one other area that you mentioned, Jeff. You talked about fair and balanced, which is a Roger Ailes phrase, I think, designed to confuse people about Fox News. But even the notion of balance, it goes back to objectivity, which I think, again, is impossible for anyone, much less a journalist. I think we shouldn't be balanced. I think we should be biased. I think we should have three biases. The first, the most important of which, is a bias for the public good. And I think that we often strive for balance, for giving each side equal space, when in fact the evidence doesn't support that. It's called false equivalence. And journalists, because they usually operate in commercial environments, don't want to alienate any readers or viewers or web visitors. And so they're always eager, I think, to try to get to find balance in stories when it doesn't exist in nature. And doing so, I think, misleads the public. And the climate change issue is probably the poster child or the primary exhibit for that, where you talk to somebody who is a discredited or non-scientist and give them equal weight with someone who is a long-established scientist who really knows this material, in and out.
That's a really good example, and I've seen that same false equivalency be applied to things like intelligent design, the controversy over creationism and things like that, where the two sides are portrayed in the press as if they have equal weight, when in fact the scientific community would certainly scoff at that.
Right.
So yeah, I can definitely see your point. One last question, and this kind of circles back to trustworthiness in news, and that is a student asks, what news sources do you trust? Well, what's your news consumption diet like? What do you read or listen to?
Yeah, I get a daily paper subscription to the New York Times. It costs me about $90 a month, but I'm happy to support good journalism because I think we're in a period now where the business model of particularly print journalism is imploding. So I paid and I delight in going out on my front porch and picking up the New York Times every day and read it with my breakfast. I also listen to National Public Radio. I listen to other programs carried through that network, such as Terry Gross's wonderful interview program, Fresh Air. And I listen to Planet Money and other, NPR products. I listen to On the Media, which is out of WNYC in New York. They come out every week. I look at the San Francisco Chronicle. I have electronic subscription to them, as well as the Mercury News in San Jose. I have a subscription to the New Yorker, to Columbia Journalism Review. I read academic journals when I can stay awake. And those are my primary sources of news. And if I see something that, over time, you develop a picture in your head of the world and how it works. And when something challenges that, I'll often go deeper. I'll look for a magazine article. I'll look for a government report, an authoritative source that explains an issue, particularly if it contradicts my worldview, because I think journalists should always be curious. You should always be looking for information that contradicts the way you understand the world, because you recognize that your understanding of the world is imperfect, it's evolving, and you have an obligation to the public to try to be as accurate as you can.
Great. Well, I think that is going to be a wrap. So thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with the class.
My pleasure.
We'll probably take a deeper dive into detecting bull later this semester. So thanks again for sharing your thoughts, especially about media literacy, news literacy, and we'll be in touch, I guess, at some point. Good
yeah, and I'm
luck with
happy
your
to
tennis
answer
game.
any further questions that come up, because once you've read something, you know, something may strike you, and as a question, I'm happy to follow up.
Great. Thank you so much, John. Take care. Have a great day.
My pleasure. You too.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
And for everyone else watching, this will be archived on YouTube. It takes maybe 20 minutes or so for the video to process, but then I'll put the link on Blackboard for people to watch. So thanks again for tuning in live if you are watching it in real time. Bye, everybody.